Hi, my name is Sean Mabry. I'm a writer, and today I wanted to talk about something a little different, which I will connect back to writing at the end, but this was something that occurred to me yesterday that I think is a really big gap in our culture right now. And so this is my own humble attempt to try to bridge that gap. And I'm talking specifically about emotional labor. And just to give a really quick overview of that term, in case you haven't heard it, it's more and more talked about these days, but just in case, it was originally termed by the sociologist Arlie Hochschild in a book called The Managed Heart. And the idea behind emotional labor is very simply when you are in a context where you have to regulate your emotions for the sake of others. And almost always, when we talk about emotional labors, we are talking about some sort of job. We're talking about a place where you're being paid to do a certain thing. And the difficulty around emotional labor, the reason why it's important to talk about and why there is so much conversation about it, is that because our society is traditionally patriarchal and has certain assumptions about what counts as real labor and what doesn't, emotional labor tends to get overlooked and undervalued. So the classic example is you look at someone like a stewardess on an airline. Now, and that's actually one of the classic examples that Arlie uses in her book. Hochschild, I should say. Hochschild is in her book. What that airline stewardess, or I guess steward these days, is expected to do is to show up and smile and be friendly with the passengers. And again, in a traditional kind of patriarchal, very sort of, I guess, materialistic, in a certain sense, culture, that's read as an easy job because there's not a lot of physical labor involved. The physical labor is pushing a wheeled cart up and down the aisle, not especially difficult. But the emotional labor actually is fairly difficult. And so that's why it's become an important topic in the world of sociology to expose emotional labor, draw more attention to it, and hopefully create a more balanced distribution of emotional labor. Now, I'm not here to try to convert men that don't believe in emotional labor to that necessarily. It does exist and it is real, but I want to try to actually approach this from a different angle because I think that the big gap on both sides of the issue, both among the what tend to be left-leaning, feminist-leaning folks who do argue very passionately for emotional labor, and what tend to be the more conservative, right-leaning folks who discount it as a trend or a fad or something that doesn't actually exist. What they're both missing is that there's this kind of unwritten assumption that emotional labor is something only feminine people do, or it only really applies to feminine-coded industries or feminine-coded work. And that's simply not true. Because the thing that both sides miss is that traditionally masculine roles and masculine coded work also includes emotional labor. It just includes a different kind of emotional labor. And I think if we can look carefully at what we're doing and understand that we are also committing acts of emotional labor, I think it'll become a lot easier to relate to women who are arguing for their emotional labor, and if nothing else, to see where they're coming from and be able to find some sort of common ground. So let me walk through an example of this. So, I recently, at my day job, was working on a project, and basically we'd been just putting together a huge marketing sequence, automated marketing sequence, and there were some pretty serious grammatical errors that didn't get through our review process and ended up going out to the public, and and that obviously didn't reflect great on us as an organization. So I went back and kind of did my research and figured out how those errors even showed up in the first place, and I found out that they actually came from my boss. He was the one who introduced those errors into the sequence. And so I basically, had to reach out and say, hey, look, we need to establish a process where I get a chance to review these things before they go out, because quite frankly, that's my strength. I'm a writer. I know how to proof and edit very quickly and easily. So I had to make the emotional effort of speaking up and identifying a problem and risk being criticized or risk being shut down or risk, having an adverse reaction to having to point out a flaw in my superior, right? And that's something that I think basically anyone can relate to, but I think it's a really good example for men to look at, because any man that's accomplished anything really in any sort of field, you've probably had that moment where you saw, because you had more of a kind of ground floor perspective, you saw that there was something going wrong, you decided to step up and report this to make sure that the problem actually could get fixed, rather than letting sleeping dogs lie. And that right there, that's an act of emotional labor. A few others examples I could point to, not necessarily from my own experience, but other very common examples are, doing something. I mean, sales is a great example. Sales includes a ton of emotional labor, and a lot of times courage. Anytime that anything that men and men can talk about courage very easily, right? Like we're trained to think in terms of courage and bravery and whatnot. So just understand that anytime you're doing something that feels courageous, that's an act of emotional labor, because you're regulating the emotion of fear, you're suppressing the emotion of fear so that you can take an action in spite of that fear. Now that's really very similar to a woman in a more service-oriented position who might have had a bad day. She might be, any number of things could be throwing off her emotional mood. So maybe her base emotion is sadness, but she's pushing that down to display an emotion of happiness so that the people around her have a better experience. That is emotional labor, and that's very, very similar. In fact, it's effectively the same thing that you do when you commit an act of courage. So what does all this have to do with writing? Bringing it back to the main topic of this channel. And by the way, there's a lot of meat here. If you are at all curious about emotional labor, I highly recommend you go and do your own research on it. But again, this is a very surface level treatment, just kind of introducing some new ideas. But bringing it back to writing, one of the biggest problems that young male writers specifically run into is that when they want to write a heroic character, male or female sometimes, because and in fact a lot of times it feels even more jarring when they do this to female characters, but they'll write that character doing something courageous, right? And oftentimes doing it in a way that makes it look effortless, right? Like they do it with a smile on their face, or they just charge into battle, or whatever it is. And afterwards, there's no consequence for that character within themselves. And one of the biggest things to understand with emotional labor is that emotional labor comes with consequences that are almost identical to physical labor. So picture for a moment a long-distance runner has just run a race and they just stepped off the track. Now, would you ask them to go and, do push-ups or go and run and grab you a coffee or something? Like, no, that's crazy. Like everyone understands that runner, because they've just exerted themselves and done an enormous act of physical labor, they now need to enter a period of physical recovery, which might not be totally inactive. It probably include some stretching, and might include taking certain supplements. But one way or another, they are out. We understand that they have done the labor. Now they need to enter recovery, because if they don't, their body is going to break down, right? If they keep pushing themselves past that point, eventually they will hit a breaking point, and they will have some sort of negative consequence in their bodies because they have overexerted themselves. Well, emotional labor works the same way. If you are doing heavy emotional labor without any sort of emotional recovery afterwards, you're going to have you're going to have quite literally an emotional breakdown. And this again, going back to the original studies, this is one of the big consequences of emotional labor that sociologists are trying to draw attention to, is that because it's unrecognized, undervalued, underappreciated, many times people who are in positions of doing primarily emotional labor are expected to just keep doing it without rest for long extended periods of time without any real emotional recovery. And then people are somehow mystified that they have an adverse reaction. They have emotional breakdowns, things go haywire. And it's because, again, going back to this analogy with physical labor, they aren't getting their proper recovery. And so what you need to do to write realistic characters in moments of bravery is that you need to show one of two things after the act of bravery. And really, this applies to male characters, female characters, non-binary characters, anyone, because these are really, emotional labor is a fundamentally human issue. It ultimately truly isn't gender. That's the big mistake we keep making. One of two things needs to happen after the act of courage. One, is that that character does nothing to enact their emotional recovery, and then something goes wrong. And in well-written fiction, one of the great, in fact, this can be a really useful plot device for you, is that if someone's just gotten out of a very stressful situation and they haven't done anything to decompress, that their consequence, because they are not going through emotional recovery, might be that they let slip something that they were trying to keep secret, or they snap at someone that they care about and end up creating a new conflict, or deepening an existing conflict with one of the other characters, especially if it's, a teammate. That is a very realistic and very it makes for good drama. I mean that's a tool you want to keep in your tool belt and use. Just keep, and anytime you have a character doing something courageous, like, just keep in mind that is right after that fact, right after that scene, is a great opportunity for them to have emotional wear and tear, let something out, let them do something that they normally wouldn't do when they have more of their emotional regulation in place. The other option is to show that character doing something to emotionally recover. And I think, again, in well-written fiction, you can see this particularly with mentor characters, and oftentimes the mentor character will actually teach this to the protagonist as part of their own journey of growth. Is that you see that the heroic mentor coming to do something brave, and the protagonist is dazzled, and they're like, oh wow, I can't wait to be a big badass like they are, and then they see them afterwards doing something very calm and soothing, and perhaps even coded as feminine. I think this works really well for masculine characters, is to show them doing something kind of gentle and feminine after an act of bravery, and it's actually quite realistic, because oftentimes the men that are able to sustainably do courageous acts in the real world have some, whether they recognize it or not, whether they would put it in this language or not, they actually have some sort of ritualized form of emotional recovery that they do between these acts, so that they can keep up the emotional regulation it requires to go and do courageous things. And to show that in a story really, really makes that character realistic. And I think that's when you really, really make that character even more admirable and impressive, because people will intuitively understand that this character is wise, that they are experienced, and that their ability to do courageous things goes beyond mere bravado. It comes from experience and wisdom and a deep understanding of their purpose and their role. So that is just kind of a very, very simple introduction to emotional labor, and a quick way to tie it back into the writing. I know I'm going a little bit out on a limb with this one, so feel free to comment. Either way, if I make sense, if I don't make sense, if you agree, if you disagree, I'd love to hear your feedback. So that's it for this week. Sorry I didn't get a video out last week. Last week was a little bit chaotic, but hopefully I'll get another one out next week. So thank you all for listening and watching. See you all next time.